Hello. This session will be having in conversation TCA Raghavan ji, and he will be in conversation with Rima Hooja ji. उनको इस मंच पे बुलाने के पहले मैं चाहूंगा आप सब विराजमान हो जाएं, सेटल हो जाएं. We are going to start this session right away. As soon as we have all of you settled here. अगर वहाँ पे जगह कम है तो यहाँ पे भी जगह, यहाँ पे भी आके सेटल हो सकते हैं. And meanwhile, let me brief you about the man of the moment, the author for this rather incredible session. We are delighted to have TCA Raghavan ji as the author. He is a former Indian Foreign Service officer and author who has been the Indian High Commissioner to Singapore and Pakistan. He has considerable experiences in South Asia policy issues and is considered an expert on Pakistan studies, including heading the division of the Ministry of External Affairs for Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iran, PAI, Pakistan Occupied Iran Division. From 6 June 2013 till his retirement in 2015, Raghavan ji was the High Commissioner of India to Pakistan. He is also a historian with 3 well-received books. The first is entitled Attendant Lords, Bairam Khan and Abdul Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India. It was also awarded the Muhammad Habib Prize for Medieval Indian History by the Indian History Congress in December 2017, and I believe that calls for an applause. Yes. His latest book is entitled History Men, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, Raghubir Singh and their quest for India's past. Please join me in welcoming to the dais the author TCA Raghavan ji. जोरदार तालियां होनी चाहिए उनके स्वागत के लिए. And we are again happy to have as the discussant Rima Hooja ji. She is the member of Society for Culture and Environment. She is also an archaeologist and a renowned historian. She is also the director of SMS Museum City Palace Jaipur, Director Jaigarh, Managing Trustee Jaipur Virasat Foundation and a fellow Royal Asiatic Society and the Vice President of ICOMOS India. Formerly members, yes, of course, तालियां होनी चाहिए. Formerly member, National Monuments Authority. Her books include Maharana Pratap, Crusader for Self-Rule, Rajasthani Stories Retold and History of Rajasthan. Her latest book is on Amez Raja Mansingh. We are extremely delighted to have both of you, and I would request both the dignitaries to please begin with a rather interesting session.
Big copies at the book show here also. So, given that we have limited time, time is always limited in our lifetime, let's launch into this straight away. You do go around because you're known as a foreign service man. You've been our ambassador to Pakistan, among other things. But you have a PhD in history. So we're all made up of lots of things. You know, we are not just single in our identity. We have multiple identities. At this point, let me ask you about when the historian identity became important for you, or interest in history became important for you, or was always the case?
Well, thank you, and thank you very much, Raghav and the Bhopal Literature Festival for inviting me. I always love coming to Bhopal. It's a city I grew up in and have spent many years here, so I'm delighted every time I get an invitation to come here. Well, I studied history for my MA. I had made an error of judgment for my undergraduation when I joined physics, but overcame that and did history. And then at that time, like everyone else, you wanted to finish your MA and join something or the other as quickly as possible. So I bought a ticket for the biggest lottery in town at that time, which was the UPSC exam, and joined the Foreign Service. But about soon after joining it, I realized that if you have to retain your sanity as a civil servant, you need something extra which is private to you. That you can't just rely on being a civil servant and go through that tunnel and appear and emerge as reasonably sane unless you have an extra interest. So that is when I started looking at history as a serious interest.
We're going to follow that route a little bit, but since you mentioned Bhopal, it's not just you, right? Your father, your uncle, you're an MP man in that sense. Let's share that with the audience a little bit.
Well, I grew up in Bhopal in the early 60s. At that time, St. Joseph's Convent, right on top of the Idgah Hills, was co-educational. So I was there in class 2 and 3 over there, and I remember the school bus used to go past the lakes, which appear much bigger today. So that's possibly a good thing. But then I was out for a few years. My father was posted out. I came back, was in Campion School, and studied there for some years. And have kept coming back to Bhopal and to Madhya Pradesh. In a sense, because of that earlier knowledge of Madhya Pradesh, when I decided to develop this extra interest and I decided to do a PhD, I chose as the topic something which was odd even then, which was the agrarian history of the Narmada Valley. And I remember in 89, 90, I used to spend a large part of my leave in Hoshangabad, Narsinghpur and Jabalpur in the district record offices. So I have very strong associations with Madhya Pradesh. But Bhopal was a different city from the time I was in school. I remember as a schoolboy, we used to go and stand outside the Madhya Pradesh board. It was called the Madhya Pradesh Board for secondary exams, I think, building, only for the reason that it was the only building in Bhopal then with a lift. So the whole of the Arera Hills was just hills. Vallabh Bhavan was still under construction. The Birla Mandir had just about come up a few years earlier. So it was a different city. But it's nice to come back and revisit a place where I've grown up.
Well, what you've said actually is really your historian's lens also gets built. You know, if you think of it, for a lot of people, history is something they study in school and they get bored out of their minds because of remembering dates. And history isn't that. It's humans who've lived. In most cases, we are studying people who've lived and died. But it's not just, you know, Sikandar ne Porus se ki thi ladai, main kya karu? Wo ji gaye, they were humans. So when we go into a museum and you look at, say, a bead, that bead was worn by someone. And what you've just, you know, they would have had same aspirations, maybe. We don't know. We do know through what you study. And what you've said about the Bhopal of that period is one layer of that history. And then you mentioned working on the early records. That too, perhaps, you know, I don't know, maybe growing up with your father being posted all over, you were maybe not aware of what revenue records mean, but the fact that you get to different places, there's life there are people there. Did that play some sort of a role? Were you conscious at that time about going the road of history?
Well, I think working in the records rooms in the this was in the late 1980s, certainly one part of what you're saying was appeared very evident, that while a lot of the world had changed, but there were certain realities which had not changed. And you got a sense of those realities by looking at earlier records, especially records of peasant holdings and revenue payments and how markets came to be. But more than that, you also realized as to how thin is the presence of government when you look at the expanse of, especially a large state like Madhya Pradesh. That while we think that government is everything and can do everything. Actually, it can't. It can't move mountains. So the limitations of government and the more important factors being intrinsic to the land, intrinsic to the soil, larger term economic and social changes, certainly all that becomes very evident.
And then at some point, you also then have worked, they mentioned the other books, and we will come back to Behram Khan maybe and Abdur Rahim Khana and that generation. But let us move to another generation that you've worked very well on, very solidly on. That's the book right here on the historians. So we seem to have three very important figures who are in connect with each other. And I want you to take over now. So these three.
You see, Jadunath Sarkar was in his time, and his time at the peak of his reputation was from roughly 1915 till about 1955 when he died. He was India's greatest and best known historian. And he had a close friend and associate, G.S. Sardesai, who used to work on Maratha history. And Raghubir Singh was a student of Jadunath Sarkar. Raghubir Singh was also the Maharaja. He was the heir, the Maharaj Kumar of a small princely state near Indore, Sitamau. So, in a sense, Jadunath Sarkar and G.S. Sardesai mentored Raghubir Singh. Now, when I committed that error of judgment of joining physics honors in St. Stephen's College, I realized after about 6 months that physics is not for me. And I was desperately looking for things which would help me escape from mathematics and equations. And I found this book, which was a collection of extraordinary letters which Jadunath Sarkar and G.S. Sardesai used to write to each other. Now, there's nothing, what is extraordinary about these letters is how totally remote they were from whatever I did in Delhi then, because they were about railway timetables and how do I get to this place, and is this the place where this battle was fought, is this the route this army took. So I used to read those, and then quite by chance I also found letters between Raghubir Singh and Jadunath Sarkar. And this is in the 70s. I was an undergraduate student. So I read them and somehow managed to finish physics honors and forgot all about it. The next part of the story is when I was writing my book on Abdur Rahim Khan, someone told me go to Sitamau. So I had a vague idea because I knew about Raghubir Singh, about Sitamau. So I went there and found this wonderful research library where there was a great deal of material on Abdur Rahim Khan. But I also found Raghubir Singh's original letters, which really led me to this book, which is about Raghubir Singh, his life, his times, and also Jadunath Sarkar and G.S. Sardesai.
So this is the appropriate moment to share with the audience something about the life of these three men, whichever order you want to take it.
Well, Jadunath Sarkar, as I said, from the middle of the 1910s till the late 1940s, he was a towering
Let's go back a little
personality.
in time for Jadunath Sarkar also. How does he get to be where he is? Because you've looked at all of that in your book.
Well, he studied in Calcutta. At that time they did not have a MA in history, so he did a MA in English literature, but developed an interest in history, started teaching it, and then started writing and reading a lot of history. He did a lot of research on his own, and by 1908 or 1909, decided that the one figure who needed to be studied in detail was Aurangzeb. So Aurangzeb, like now, even then, was a contentious figure, but Jadunath Sarkar devoted some 15 years of his life to writing about Aurangzeb, and he wrote a history of Aurangzeb in 5 volumes, which really established to a great extent his reputation, but really added that cutting edge to that reputation was that in as he was writing and studying about Aurangzeb, he encountered then the Marathas, which is how his friendship with G.S. Sardesai began. And in encountering the Marathas, he realized that if he's writing about Aurangzeb, he has to write about Shivaji also. So he wrote a book about Shivaji. And in many ways, 1919 was a fundamental year for Indian history writing. Because in that year, the volume 3 of Sarkar's History of Aurangzeb came out, along with a history of Shivaji. So he wrote about both Shivaji and Aurangzeb. And it's surprising that for a very long time afterwards, you have not had people studying both these individuals in an objective, quote-unquote, scientific way, in the way Sarkar did. And after that, he became, a larger-than-life figure. He was the crowning deity of Indian history writing and remained in that position for the next 30 years. In the process, he also elevated G.S. Sardesai, who was a historian of the Marathas, who helped Sarkar work on Shivaji, on Maratha history. And that is what led to their becoming close friends. And they were friends from 1907 till 1956 or 57 when they both died.
They both died within a year and a half of each other, I think.
Yes.
But Sardesai was slightly more, maybe, is conventional the right word?
Sardesai was less well known. You see, Sarkar was a master of English prose writing. So his books, when they were published, would be read all over the English-speaking world. He was reviewed in the best British journals. He was known to the British establishment, the colonial establishment in India. They handled him with great respect. He was members of different government committees. He was very much of a establishment figure. Sardesai was a more provincial figure. He was in Baroda and then in Pune.
He had a rural childhood.
He wrote principally in Marathi until Sarkar told him that if you keep writing in Marathi, nobody will read you. Your books will not be reviewed in the best journals. You won't get an international audience. So he, in fact, forced him to start writing in English, and which Sardesai did. But in the process, they formed both a friendship, but also a working understanding that we can do much more together than we can do individually.
So before we bring then Maharaj Kumar Raghuveer Singh of Sitamau into this story, or reintroduce him, why do you think they were wanting to study history at this point? These two individuals who come together, who are in contact primarily through letters. They meet occasionally, but they're not meeting every day. They're not in the same town. They're not necessarily in the same space, but they're mentally connected.
Well, there were many reasons. I think the first thing is that this was the age of nationalism. And with nationalism came the desire to know more about your own history. There was also the sense, which they don't say so openly, but I think that sense was there, that why should only Englishmen write the history of India? And when Sarkar was writing, he was certainly the first generation of Indians writing serious Indian history. Till then, it had principally been British civil servants and British historians writing history. And Sarkar felt that, no, we should write our own, we have to write our own history. It's too important to be left to outsiders. But I think what also drove them was the desire to write history based on authentic records. They didn't want to simply recirculate what had been written earlier. They wanted to go to the root sources. So a large part of their history writing was in fact also a process of discovery, of trying to find records and trying to study them and finally move them into some kind of an archive. So that really sums up Sarkar's and Sardesai's endeavor, that it was the first generation of Indians writing history for Indians, but writing it based on authentic records and trying to write it objectively.
I think we're going to touch on the archives in a bit. But to an extent, the kind of work you did looking at archives is the kind of work they were doing, which is in contrast to the original records that a lot of them were studying, which would have been somebody writing about a ruler. You know, it would have been a 15th, 14th, even a 3rd century piece of theatre. But in most cases, you would then write in glowing words about the local ruler. You're not necessarily critiquing them. And I think, would you like to share how you would draw a fine line between, say, history writing, you know, trying to be as neutral as possible and to work on facts, if they can be neutral facts, and the kind of writing that was available without the records that G.S. Sardesai and Jadunath Sarkar look at, the kind of eulogizing or that equivalent that exists?
Well, you see, Sarkar, especially Sarkar, but also Sardesai to some extent, and certainly Raghubir Singh later, they were driven by a certain conviction that my job as a historian is to try to tell the truth as I know it. It doesn't matter if that truth is unpalatable. It doesn't matter if that truth doesn't serve my national interest. My job as a historian is to try to tell the truth as I know it. And they certainly understood that someone else could have a different point of view. But the condition they imposed was that I'm telling the truth as I know it because it's based on a certain documentary record. This is the evidence, and it is on this basis and these facts that I'm saying X, Y, and Z. And it is my job, it is my duty to say it clearly. I don't have to mythologize anyone. I don't have to try to hide anything. I should tell the truth as simply and as directly as I know it. Now, this was, as it would be now, a very difficult enterprise even in the 1920s and 30s. Because you must understand, this was the age of nationalism. And Sarkar, for instance, when he wrote about Shivaji, there was a storm of criticism of him, especially in what is now Maharashtra. Because they thought that here is this Bengali, here's this outsider, and he's trying to run down one of our great icons, which is Shivaji. Now, Sarkar was a great admirer of Shivaji, but he felt that I have to write his history based on what the documentary record tells me, and not what the Maratha nationalists would like it to appear. He had written about Aurangzeb, and it had led to a similar storm of criticism in much the same terms. He was also an admirer of Aurangzeb, that Aurangzeb brought the Mughal empire to its greatest territorial extent in South Asia, that he was a very hard-working ruler. He was not one given to idle pleasures like most of the other Mughals. But he also brought out various other very, very unpalatable things about Aurangzeb, which led to some amount of criticism. And the view was that you are raising these divisive issues. His view was, Sarkar's view, and this is something which he constantly drummed into both G.S. Sardesai and Raghubir Singh, that it's not my job to see whether what I'm writing is acceptable or not. I have to narrate history in the way I understand it to be true. So it was a very, very controversial exercise, because they were writing about issues which were not academic by any senses. You know, these were live political issues which led to a considerable amount of criticism. Sardesai, for instance, was ostracized by the intellectual community of Pune for a very long period of time, because he was seen as an associate of Sarkar, who was this outsider writing critically about the Marathas.
So narrating what you know to be true through facts, through evidence, through documents, through all of that. Let us bring this mentoring, as you put it, which is true, of Maharaj Kumar Raghubir, then Maharaj Kumar Raghubir Singh of Sita Mao, later Maharaj of Sita Mao, and turning him into a historian who never then looked back.
Well, Raghubir Singh, when he was in his early 20s, decided to do very unusually, because he was the Maharaja of he was going to be the Maharaja of a a princely state. You don't expect Maharajas and Maharaj Kumars to be doing PhDs. But he enrolled for a PhD in the University of Agra in 1925. One of the teachers in Agra University then suggested to Raghuveer Singh that he write to Jadunath Sarkar and ask him to be his research guide. And now Raghuveer Singh did so with some nervousness because, as I said, Sarkar was a larger-than-life figure in India at that time. But Sarkar accepted him readily. He was happy at the idea that, I've got a prince who's my student. And that is how their journey began. And Raghuveer Singh wrote a history of Malwa in the 18th century. That book is still in print. The title is Malwa in Transition. And he was awarded a PhD in 1927 or 1928. But by then he had decided that I am going to be a historian. I'm not really going to be anything else except a historian, and I'm going to devote myself to the serious study of history for the rest of my life. And he precisely did that. He converted his palace into a research library, and both Jadunath Sarkar and Raghuveer and G.S. Sardesai realized that this was something very unusual happening. Because if you visit Sitamau, and some of you should definitely go there, it's a very remote place even today. It's the nearest airport is Indore, which is a 4-hour drive. The nearest railhead is about 50 kilometers away. Sitamau is remote by even present day, certainly by present day standards. In the 1920s, it was the back of nowhere. To think of setting up a center for historical research or a historical research library, I think Sarkar and Jadunath and G.S. Sardesai realized that something very unusual is happening in the middle of central India, and they should do what they can to help that process. And Raghuveer Singh really started this great enterprise of building up a research library, collecting documents from all over central India, to the extent that by the time he died, and he died quite late in the 1980s, but the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and to a great extent even now, for anyone anywhere in the world, if you want to study the history of central India in the 18th century, you have to go to Sitamau. There is no other archival collection like that anywhere else in the world. I mean, I've said it many times. I think this is Madhya Pradesh's undiscovered or unpolished. It's a polished diamond. It's an undiscovered jewel.
Undiscovered jewel. It's not just material on, say, central India. At one point, I think it was the Punjabi University, Patiala, they were doing a whole volume series on history of Sikhism. And one document that they wanted translated, they thought it was Rajasthani. Now, Rajasthani is basically Devanagari script. You just need to have a few words which are different. And जिसको पेट कटा श जिसको बोलते हैं, उसका opposite direction में अगर है, तो वो ढूंढारी में या मेरवाड़ी में या मारवाड़ी में ख होता है. तो पढ़ना मुश्किल नहीं है, लेकिन हाथ से लिखा हुआ होता है. Now, there was a document which by the name of it is very Persian, तोहफ़तुल अहबाब, दोस्तों के लिए एक तोहफा, which was actually a history of Punjab, supposedly written or is written in Rajasthani, and they said, can you do a translation? Now that was out of the Sitamau collection. So he must have just been anything.
Because he was a historian, and because he was, he was the ruler of a princely state, he understood what princely states have, the value of which they don't know or they want to keep hidden. Because all the princesses have various skeletons in their cupboards which they didn't want to expose or which they didn't want people to know about, and over a period of time they forgot all about it. Now, Raghuveer Singh knew what these different princely houses had in their records room, And he felt that these are just decaying and being destroyed by termites, and he would go from one to the other. That, you can't look after this, you give it to me, I'll look after them. And because he was one of them, he had far more success in this enterprise than anyone else would have. Because he could approach rulers directly one to one. So he went to many of the smaller states in Rajputana or Rajasthan, certainly to all the other neighboring states in central India and the other principally states in Madhya Pradesh. But in the process of 20, 30 years, he built up this huge collection. And he also, in many ways, was much ahead of his time, because he sent word around to all the neighboring villages that any of you who have old papers, please deposit it in my library. And in fact, if you go there now, there are bastas and bastas and bastas which are just lying there, because it takes time to catalog them, to record them properly, to index them. But that is a task left for subsequent generations. He saw that I must put them together and at least begin the process whereby you can build up a regional archive which is of international standard.
Well, you have certainly used that archive well. And I don't know how we are going with time, so I need to get this question in. As they said in the introduction, I am working in the Maharaja Savai Man Singh Museum in Jaipur now. Now, the history of Jaipur State is one of the books that Jadunath Sarkar wrote, History of Jaipur State. It is one of the earliest, or I think the earliest one in English, which covers this history of a large state. The then state, pre-integration into India, was roughly the size of Switzerland. So it's not a small, today we've forgotten, you've forgotten how large the state of Bhopal was. Sita Mao you think of as a place. Jhabua, we forget that they had territorial areas attached to them. Now, Jaipur, there was a history, but most of it was what people had written before. There hadn't been a proper analytical, critical history written. At some point, Jadunath Sarkar gets permission and writes this history of Jaipur State. It later gets suppressed for a while. Let's have that story from you.
Well, Sarkar was working in the Jaipur archives because he got interested in the Jaipur archives because that had the most authentic and original record of Shivaji when he was in custody in Agra. You remember Shivaji was sent by Jai Singh to Agra, and then he was taken into custody. So he was in the custody of Jai Singh's son. And Jai Singh's son would send a daily dispatch to his father about what was happening with
Kumar
Shivaji,
Ram Singh.
to Kumar Ram Singh. So those records were all in the Jaipur archives, and Sarkar wanted to see them. And as a quid pro quo, he was asked to write a history of Jaipur State. I don't think the Jaipur court realized what they were getting, because when he gave them the manuscript, they decided to lock it up and throw away the key. So he wrote the history sometime in 1928 or 1932 or 33, and then it lay forgotten for about 50 years. Raghuveer Singh knew about this, and from 1971-72 he started writing to the then Maharaja and the then Maharani that you must publish this history, and if there's anything objectionable, I undertake to edit it, and so on. And finally, after about 10 years, they said you publish it as it is. Now you can wonder as to why they were so sensitive, but perhaps there were reasons, and there are perhaps both good and bad reasons why they were so sensitive about it. But finally that history was published in the mid-1980s by Raghuveer Singh, and he felt that he had now discharged his last debt to his former teacher. The point is that I do hope you will visit Sita Mao, because if you are interested in history, it gives you a really deep insight as to how an entirely indigenous impulse can become such a great force in history writing in India.
They want to go in for questions, but I do want to say before we do that, that you should please pick up a copy of this and read it, because it will help you understand what goes through the mind of someone trying to write as truthfully as possible about something for which you only have little bits of a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes the picture is more complete, sometimes less complete. And then what you choose to write. Because you can always take to literature or fiction writing, which a lot of people have done. You can populate an entire world, whether it is on Mars or Jupiter or Tibet or even Harappa, as fiction, or you opt to present facts, and that is certainly something you have done here. We will need another session, we'll need several sessions to find out
That's
much
true.
more about what you have done with Abdul Rahim Khane Khana, who to most people is also the poet Rahim. And when we have a whole lot about, Haldi Ghati, things we're not getting into here. But the motto of Mewar, Jo Drid Rakhe Dharm Ko, Tahi Rakhe Kartar, is also one of the things that Rahim wrote.
Yes.
So, this is a very, going into the past is really helping us understand a part of ourselves a little better. You also understand that, humans, whichever part, whether they live in Papua New Guinea or Tierra del Fuego, which early records tell us there was a point where they had fire, but they didn't have any animals to get skin from. You learn about the world through history, geography, all of these things. As you said, they were looking at travel routes of armies marching. So there's an entire thing which you will get if you read the book. But having plugged the book on your behalf, Dr. Raghavan, let us open the question.
Yes.
Let us open the floor.
Of course, history becomes interesting when people who convey history are as interesting as Raghavanji and Seemaji. Let's move on. Rimaji, I'm sorry. Moving on to the first question there.
I'm Arun Gurutu, basically a science student, but yes, love history to read now. Why did Sarkar choose Aurangzeb as his subject rather than the other Mughal emperors, including Akbar?
Thank you.
Well, because the others had been written about. You see, Winston Smith had written a book about Akbar. Beveridge had written about Jahangir. He thought there was a gap in Aurangzeb. Now, possibly he also chose to do so because he realized it would be controversial, that it was reflective of the period he lived in Bengal in the early 20th century. That is speculative. But the principal reason which he always gave was that there was a gap, that the other great Mughal emperors, Akbar, Jahangir, to some extent Shah Jahan, had been written upon. Aurangzeb was a gap.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. There.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, please.
So you talked about neutrality and objectivity from the part of the writer.
Please be a bit louder.
You talked about neutrality and objectivity from the part of the writer, that the writer should write history based on archives, facts and records. But now how do we as a reader, and in the information age when there are contending narratives, how do we ensure that what we're reading is actually neutral and objective?
So there's no easy way. You have to read a lot, and don't read WhatsApps. If you read one book and you feel that this is interesting, but I need to know more, then read a second book by someone else about the same issue. Don't read WhatsApps. I mean, the university of WhatsApp, especially where history writing is concerned, is to be avoided at all costs.
May I add something to this? So, historian Norbert Peabody wrote about his painting in Kota. Historically, we know that a particular ruler was killed by Khane Jahan Lodi in a certain battle. We're not going into dates, not going into... What is painted there in Kota, which is discussed in this on this cover also, is the ruler of Kota killing Khane Jahan Lodi. So if you were to look at the fact there, it's a painting that shows you something that didn't happen. But when you put that with history, when you actually look up the records and say who died when, then the true picture will come your way. So I think I'm just driving home the point that you've made, but it's an amusing story of how even back then facts were often taken selectively.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the next question. Gopalakrishnan ji.
My name is Gopalakrishnan. I'm no historian. I'm a former corporate executive, but I'm very interested in history. And a simple question I am asking your opinion, and I address this to both of you as historians. What is your view? In a sense, Jadunath Sarkar was rewriting history. You know, today this word rewriting history has become very popular, not only in India but everywhere. What is your general view as a caution to readers of history? You know, not academic readers but casual readers like myself, when history is rewritten.
Well, you see, history is always going to be rewritten. It's not as if we are rewriting history today. Every generation, and within every generation, every decade will rewrite history, because it's not something dead which we are studying. Basically, it's not the past we are studying. What we are studying is our view of the past. And our view will keep changing from decade to decade, from generation to generation, and from historian to historian. So in that sense, there's nothing prima facie wrong with the rewriting of history. History should be rewritten, because otherwise you'll get stuck on some ossified view of the past which has not changed, and it'll be like any other thing which, if it doesn't change, it's a meaningless appendage. So history should be rewritten. The question is, how should it be rewritten? And which is obviously what Sarkar would have said, is that it doesn't matter what you write, but it has to be grounded in logic, it has to be grounded in documentation, and it has to stand up to what other historians or what other knowledgeable people, how it will view it. So in other words, it has to stand up to peer review. If these conditions are met, rewriting of history is a very good thing.
Okay, आखिरी सवाल.
No, I only wanted to add, it's not often rewriting, it is rethinking facets that you hear about. That's all I wanted to add.
Yes.
Yes, hi.
Oh, reunion.
That's a very long time ago. Yes.
Good to see that. Thank you so much, sir. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I am a biotechnologist but still fantasizes by the history. Sir, you said we should write based on the record. Does the KGB archive need to be touched, the most controversial records of all time, especially if we have the chapter on India?
You see, the KGB archives, after the Soviet Union broke up, it's interesting. The first thing that the State Department of the United States focused on was to get access to the Soviet archives. And before they did anything else, they cleaned out those archives. So whatever was there in the KGB archives is certainly not part of an archive. It's part of a open access domain information. Most of it is now well known. And for instance, some of the seminal issues of the 20th century, the entire Soviet record of it is no longer locked up in an archive. It's available. People have studied it. Is everything known? No. But more sources will certainly keep coming out. Will they tell you something spectacularly different about India? I don't think so. I think most of what had to be told has already been told. You see, many of these views about the connections which the Soviets had in India and the kinds of things they did, this had a larger than life view till the Soviet archive was opened up. And once it was opened up, it was realized that yes, I mean, they had certain amount of access, they did certain number of things, but no more than what the Americans or other powers tried to do.
ग्रेट, थैंक यू सो मच राघवन जी और रीमा जी. जोरदार तालियां होने चाहिए इस दिलचस्प सेशन के लिए. मैं मीनाक्षी दुआ जी को मंच पे आमंत्रित करना चाहूँगा और उनसे रिक्वेस्ट करूँगा कि वो मेमेंटोज पेश करें हमारे ऑथर और हमारे डिस्कशन को एज अ सिंबल ऑफ लव एंड रिस्पेक्ट ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ द भोपाल लिटरेचर एंड आर्ट फेस्टिवल. The memento is a picture of a highly endangered bird called lesser florican, which was captured by Padma Shri Bhalu Monde ji. वो भी कल से हमारे साथ बने हुए हैं. And it is also the mascot of the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2023. There it is, जोरदार तालियां. And such an interesting lesson, conversation on history presented to us by Raghavan ji and Rima ji, being the amazing moderator for this session. उनके लिए भी तालियां होनी चाहिए. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद आप दोनों का कि आप इस सेशन का हिस्सा बने.